The silence inside the heavily guarded courtroom was not merely a lack of noise. It was a suffocating physical weight that had been building since the gavel first struck, erasing the truth one corrupt testimony at a time. Inside the grand chamber, the air was stale with the scent of polished mahogany and the lingering sweat of terrified witnesses, though the gallery sat frozen, trapped by the sheer gravity of the trial. Elena Cash, a fiercely determined black trauma nurse whose resolve was as unyielding as the marble floor beneath her, adjusted the collar of her crisp white medical uniform. She stood confidently, clutching a faded manila folder of surgery records to her chest, her dark eyes reflecting the harsh overhead lights that beat down relentlessly against the encroaching shadows of the syndicate. It was a room built for secrets and evasions, not for the truth. And yet, the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a hollow, echoing thud that cut through the low murmurs of the prosecution. The middle-aged judge, watching from his bench with a stern expression, looked up, expecting perhaps a delayed clerk or another compromised lawyer seeking entry. But the figure that stepped into the aisle stopped the breath of everyone in the room. It was Joon-Sik, an imposing, sharply dressed East Asian man wrapped in a dark tailored suit that clung to his broad frame like armor. His expression was cold, calculating, and entirely devoid of fear. Two serious-looking bodyguards materialized behind him, alert and fiercely protective, reinforcing the terrifying reality of his influence. The gallery gasped as the heavy doors struggled against the draft, finally clicking shut and sealing the silence once more. Joon-Sik's intimidating gaze swept past the judge and the armed bailiffs, locking directly onto Elena. The nurse did not flinch, her grip tightening on the stolen medical files that started it all. To understand how a woman bound by the Hippocratic Oath ended up staring down the city's most lethal predator, one had to rewind to a bustling a suspiciously dead VIP, and the night Elena Cash decided that some lies were too deadly to ignore. The transition back to the ER had to be jarring. Just 48 hours before the courtroom standoff, Elena was merely a trauma nurse finishing a grueling double shift. The VIP patient's sudden death still hung heavy in the sterile air of the hospital corridors. Elena clutched her worn leather tote bag, the weight of the original unaltered surgical files pressing against her side like a physical brand. She knew the official autopsy report being drafted upstairs was a lie, a fabricated document designed to cover up a lethal, untraceable poison. She had the proof. She just needed to get to her car. The parking garage was a concrete cavern of echoing silence. As Elena approached her sedan, the shadows seemed to detach themselves from the pillars. 3 sleek, black SUVs materialized from the lower levels, their headlights blindingly bright before snapping off in synchronized precision, blocking her exit. Before Elena could even reach for her keys, the heavy doors opened. Men in dark suits formed an impenetrable perimeter. Then, Joon-Sik stepped into the dim fluorescent light. The imposing syndicate boss wore a tailored midnight blue suit that seemed to swallow the ambient light, his expression an impenetrable mask of cold, terrifying calculation. Elena Cash. His voice was a low, vibrating baritone that carried no overt threat, only absolute certainty. Elena's pulse hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but she forced her spine to straighten, refusing to let him see her tremble. If you're looking for the chief of surgery, he's on the 4th floor. I'm off the clock. Joon-Sik closed the distance between them with the terrifying grace of an apex predator. He stopped just inches from her, close enough for her to catch the faint, expensive scent of sandalwood and cold winter air. I am not looking for the chief of surgery. I am looking for the nurse who was in the operating room when my mentor was murdered. And more importantly, I am looking for the files you slipped into your bag 10 minutes ago. Elena's grip on the tote tightened. Those files belong to the hospital. Those files, Joon-Sik corrected softly, his dark eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made the air feel thin, belong to the truth. A truth my enemies are currently trying to erase. You will hand them over. No. The word slipped out, fearless and sharp. A dangerous flicker of surprise, and perhaps a dark edge of respect, passed through Joon-Sik's gaze. People in his world did not say no. They certainly did not stand their ground against him. You misunderstand your reality, Miss Cash. You are holding a death warrant. If my men do not take you right now, the traitors who poisoned my mentor will. You are coming with me. He didn't grab her. He didn't have to. A subtle gesture from his hand, and his bodyguard shifted, effectively sealing off any avenue of escape. The realization hit Elena with suffocating clarity. She wasn't just holding leverage. She was the ultimate target. With no other choice, she stepped into the back of his armored vehicle. The heavy doors slammed shut, locking her into a dark, luxurious cage as the engine purred to life, carrying her away from the laws of medicine and straight into the heavily guarded heart of his underworld empire. The transition from the chaotic, fluorescent-lit corridors of the emergency room to Kim Joon-Sik's sprawling, fortified estate felt like stepping into an alternate reality. High concrete walls topped with state-of-the-art security cameras swallowed the sleek SUV, as massive iron gates clamped shut behind them, sealing Elena inside a luxurious fortress. When she finally stepped out of the vehicle, her crisp white nursing uniform stood out in stark defiance against the shadows cast by the armed guards patrolling the perimeter. Inside, the penthouse was a masterpiece of cold, calculating wealth. Dark mahogany, floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the glittering city, and a suffocating silence that felt entirely unnatural to a woman whose life was measured by the frantic rhythm of heart monitors. Joon-Sik removed his tailored suit jacket, tossing it onto a leather sofa with the casual grace of a man who owned everything he surveyed. He poured a glass of amber liquid from a crystal decanter, the clinking of ice the only sound in the cavernous room. "You will stay here until the traitors in my syndicate are rooted out," he stated, not bothering to look back at her. It was a command, devoid of any room for negotiation. "Your hospital is compromised. The men who poisoned my mentor are actively hunting for the surgical records you took. This is the only place you are untouchable." Elena didn't move toward the opulent seating. She remained planted near the grand entryway, her posture rigidly professional, her grip still tight on her tote bag. "I didn't take those files to protect your empire," she said, her voice piercing the quiet room. She refused to let the intimidation of his world shrink her. "I secured them because a patient was murdered on my watch. I took an oath to do no harm, and covering up a homicide violates every ethical line I have." Joon-Sik paused, the glass halfway to his lips. He turned slowly, his dark, void-like eyes analyzing her as if she were a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. In his reality, people acted out of greed, terror, or blood loyalty. Abstract concepts like medical ethics and moral lines were merely vulnerabilities waiting to be exploited. "Your ethics almost got you killed in a parking garage," he pointed out, his voice dropping to a dangerous, velvety low. He closed the distance between them, his sheer physical presence overwhelming, a contained violence that vibrated in the quiet air. "You play by the rules of medicine, Miss Cash, but the men who doctored those files play by the rules of the underworld. They will not hesitate to silence you. And what rules do you play by?" Elena countered, tilting her chin up to unflinchingly hold his intense gaze. "You abducted me. You operate entirely outside the law. You think because you have money and armed guards, you can simply dictate my existence." A dark, dangerous flicker of something resembling respect crossed his otherwise impassive face. He stepped closer, the sharp scent of sandalwood and cold power wrapping around her. "I do not wish to dictate your existence, Elena," he murmured, the space between them suddenly feeling highly charged and far too small. "I intend to ensure it continues." The suffocating quiet of the penthouse shattered shortly after midnight. It began with the screech of tires echoing from the courtyard below, followed by the heavy, frantic thud of boots against marble. Elena stepped out of her designated wing just as the private elevator doors burst open. Kim Joon-Sik stumbled into the pristine entryway, the terrifying composure that usually cloaked him fracturing under the weight of physical trauma. His midnight blue suit was soaked, the fabric clinging to his side in a slick, dark expanse of blood. Two bodyguards flanked him, their weapons drawn, eyes wild with the adrenaline of a betrayed perimeter. They had been ambushed, not by a rival syndicate, but by men wearing their own crest. "Put him on the island," Elena commanded, the words slicing through the chaotic shouting. The guards hesitated, unused to taking orders from a prisoner, but Joon-Sik gritted his teeth and gave a sharp, definitive nod. They hauled him onto the expansive granite kitchen counter. In a heartbeat, the luxury fortress transformed into an emergency room, and the power dynamic in the penthouse fundamentally shifted. Elena was no longer a captive. She was the only authority that mattered. "Get me a medical kit. Now. Alcohol, betadine, sutures, and whatever you use for gunshot wounds in this underworld," she barked at the nearest guard, her hands already moving. She stripped off his ruined jacket, her touch clinical and urgent as she ripped his blood-soaked shirt open to expose the jagged tear in his side. Joon-Sik hissed, his muscles coiling tight, but he didn't pull away. He watched her. Even through the haze of blood loss, his dark eyes remained intensely focused, tracking her every movement. When the guard returned with a heavily stocked trauma bag, Elena went to work. The smell of copper and sharp betadine quickly overpowered the lingering scent of his expensive sandalwood cologne. She leaned over him, her dark skin a stark contrast against his pale, bruised chest as she aggressively flushed the wound. The bullet had passed through, an agonizing but clean exit, yet it had torn dangerously close to a vital vessel. "You need to hold still," she murmured, her voice dropping to a calm, steady rhythm as she threaded the suture needle. "I have endured worse, Elena," he ground out, his jaw clenched tight. She paused, her gaze flicking up to meet his. The physical distance between them was practically non-existent. She could feel the heat radiating from his skin, the heavy rhythmic thud of his heart beneath her fingertips. He was a man who commanded empires and orchestrated violence, yet here under the harsh kitchen lights, he was entirely at her mercy. "You're bleeding out on a granite counter because your own men turned on you," she said softly, her hands deftly tying off the first stitch. "Enduring isn't the same as surviving." Joon-Sik's breath hitched, not from the bite of the needle, but from the raw, unyielding truth in her eyes. As her fingers brushed against his bare skin to secure the bandage, a dark, profound tension ignited in the narrow space between them. It was a terrifying realization for the Mafia boss. The woman he had abducted to control was the only person in his fractured world he could truly trust with his life. The penthouse was submerged in the heavy, expectant silence of 3 a.m. In the dimly lit study, the sprawling mahogany desk was covered not with syndicate ledgers or territorial maps, but with the stolen, coffee-stained surgical records. Kim Joon-Sik sat rigidly in a high-backed leather chair, his injured side heavily bandaged beneath a dark silk shirt. Despite the blood loss from the ambush hours earlier, his posture remained commanding, though the terrifying mask of absolute control had fractured just enough to let Elena in. She stood closely beside him, the crisp white of her uniform now slightly rumpled, a stark contrast to the shadows of the room. "Look at the time stamps," Elena instructed, her voice a low, steady murmur. She leaned over his shoulder, tracing a line on a faded ECG printout. The physical proximity was magnetic, the sterile scent of betadine on her hands mixing intimately with his sandalwood cologne. "The official autopsy report they were drafting claimed your mentor died of sudden, catastrophic cardiac arrest due to surgical complications," Elena explained, her finger tapping a specific column of numbers. But this preliminary blood panel was drawn 20 minutes before his heart actually failed. It was buried in the raw data. Joon-Sik's dark eyes narrowed, tracking her movement. "Explain it to me." "Potassium chloride," she said, her tone clinical but laced with a dark urgency. "Administered during surgery, it's routine. But given in a massive, rapid intravenous push while a patient is in recovery, it causes an immediate, untraceable heart attack. It mimics natural failure perfectly. But whoever administered it didn't realize the automated for-pump logs the exact volume pushed, even if they deleted the patient chart." She slid a secondary log sheet across the desk. "Someone overrode the smart pump manually at 2:14 a.m. The medical staff was at shift change. Whoever did this didn't need to break in. They walked right past your men because they were already trusted." Joon-Sik absorbed the medical data with chilling comprehension. The temperature in the room seemed to drop as the pieces of the betrayal locked into place. "Only one person in my inner circle had the security clearance to bypass the floor guards during that exact window," he stated, his voice a lethal vibrating rasp. "Tae-sung." He breathed the name of his right-hand man, the underboss who had supposedly been coordinating his security. The weight of the treason settled heavily between them. Joon-Sik slowly looked up from the papers, his void-like gaze locking onto Elena's. He had built his empire on paranoia and brute force, yet the irrefutable truth required to dismantle his enemies had been delivered by a nurse armed with nothing but intellect and a highlighter. He reached out, his fingers deliberately brushing against hers as he took the file. The undeniable shift in their dynamic was complete. They were no longer captor and captive, but dangerous partners standing on the precipice of war. The fragile sanctuary of the study shattered just before dawn. The heavy mahogany doors burst open, and Joon-Sik's remaining loyal guard stumbled in, breathless and bleeding from a fresh graze on his cheek. "Boss, it's Tae-sung." The guard swallowed hard. "He knows you survived the ambush." And his men caught the security feed of the nurse examining the medical files. "He knows we have the truth." Before Joon-Sik could issue a command, the piercing wail of sirens bled through the bulletproof glass of the penthouse. It wasn't the distant ambient noise of the city. It was a synchronized swarm converging directly on the estate. Flashing red and blue lights painted the opulent room in chaotic, violent strokes. Joon-Sik moved with terrifying speed despite his freshly stitched wound, pulling back a heavy velvet drape. Down in the courtyard, a dozen armored police vehicles breached the iron gates. But they weren't operating under standard law enforcement protocols. "They are not here to uphold the law," Joon-Sik stated, his voice a low, vibrating rasp of pure menace. "Tae-sung has mobilized the corrupt precincts under his payroll. He is using a badge to finish what his assassins could not." He turned to Elena, the imposing Mafia boss shedding his calm veneer for cold, calculated urgency. He pulled a sleek black firearm and an encrypted drive from his desk drawer. "He is framing you," Joon-Sik told her, closing the distance between them. "By morning, every news outlet will report that a disgruntled, unstable nurse poisoned a VIP, and they have an arrest warrant for me as an accomplice. If those officers put handcuffs on us, we will never make it to a booking cell. We will be executed in transit." Elena didn't panic. Her trauma-trained mind instantly compartmentalized the fear, shifting into triage mode. She shoved the altered ECG printouts and the critical medical files deep into her tote bag, refusing to leave their only leverage behind. Her rigid ethical world of medicine had entirely collapsed, replaced by the lethal reality of a syndicate war. She was no longer just a witness. She was the perfect scapegoat. Heavy boots thundered down the marble hallway outside. The private elevator dinged, a jarring, mundane sound amidst the impending violence. "Put your coat on," Joon-Sik commanded, his dark eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that anchored her racing heart. He didn't ask if she was ready. He grabbed her hand, his grip firm and fiercely protective. The spark of dark tension between them flared, fueled by adrenaline and the sudden, undeniable reality that their survivals were now irreversibly tied together. Instead of heading for the main doors, he dragged her toward the study's towering bookshelf. He pressed a concealed mechanism, and the heavy wood swung open to reveal a dark, narrow service corridor. "You play by my rules now, Elena," he whispered fiercely over the sound of the penthouse doors being battered down. "Do not let go of my hand." The narrow service corridor smelled of damp concrete and ancient dust, a stark contrast to the sterile opulence they had just abandoned. Elena practically carried half of Kim Joon-Sik's weight as they navigated the labyrinthine tunnels beneath the estate, the muffled thud of police boots echoing faintly above them. Every step was a testament to his sheer willpower. The fresh sutures in his side were undoubtedly tearing under the violent strain of their escape. They emerged an hour later in the desolate, freezing shell of an abandoned subway maintenance hub. It was a ghost station stripped of light and warmth, a place where Joon-Sik's vast wealth and influence held absolutely no currency. He collapsed against a rusted steel pillar, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. The terrifying syndicate boss had been stripped of his fortress, reduced to a bleeding fugitive in the dark. "I have a contact in the harbor," Joon-Sik gritted out, his voice strained but desperately clinging to his usual authority. He fumbled for an encrypted burner phone in his jacket. "He can smuggle us out by cargo ship before Tae-sung locks down the city perimeters." "No," Elena snapped, the word sharp and definitive as it cut through the frigid air. Joon-Sik's head snapped up, his dark eyes flashing with a dangerous mix of exhaustion and dominance. "This is not a hospital floor, Elena. You do not issue the orders here. And your harbor contact is probably already bought," she fired back, refusing to shrink away from his imposing glare. She dropped her heavy tote bag onto a rusted oil barrel and pulled out the stolen medical files. "Tae-sung controls the police, and he knows how you operate. He expects you to flee into the shadows. If you run, you play right into his hands. He wants you out of the city or dead in an alley so he can claim the throne. Running makes you a guilty ghost." Joon-Sik stared at her, the burner phone pausing in his hand. The silence between them stretched, thick with adrenaline and shifting authority. "We don't run," Elena continued, her voice dropping to a calm, clinical precision. We fight him where he has no power. In the light. I know the hospital's internal audit system. I know how the board covers up malpractice to protect their funding. If we trace the digital override code on that 4 pump, we don't just expose Taesung. We expose the corrupt hospital administrators he paid off. She stepped closer, the physical distance vanishing until she was looking directly up into his eyes. You need my brain to dismantle his alibi, and I need your protection to stay alive long enough to do it. We are in this together, Joon-Sik. As equals. He looked at her, absorbing the sheer, unyielding brilliance of the black woman standing fearlessly before him. The brutal Mafia king realized his survival no longer depended on his guns, but on her intellect. Slowly he lowered the phone. A dark, reverent smirk ghosted across his pale lips as he reached out, his knuckles lightly grazing the dust from her cheekbone. As equals, he murmured, sealing their dangerous pact in the dark. The sterile glow of a laptop screen was the only light in the cramped, dust-sheeted safehouse Joon-Sik had secured on the edge of the docks. Elena sat cross-legged on a worn mattress, her fingers flying across the keyboard with clinical precision, while the Mafia boss stood by the window, a silent, imposing guardian nursing his sutured wound. Using a backdoor she knew the IT department routinely ignored, Elena breached the hospital's encrypted administrative server. The stolen ECG files beside her were the map. She just needed to find the digital footprint of the person who authorized the lethal override on the 4 pump. The hospital logs every manual override to prevent malpractice lawsuits, she murmured, her eyes scanning lines of green code. Taesung might own the police, but he doesn't know how hospital servers archive deleted data. Joon-Sik turned from the window, his imposing frame closing the distance until he was standing just over her shoulder. The heat of his proximity sent a familiar, dark shiver down her spine. Did you find the authorization? I found it, Elena breathed, her fingers freezing on the trackpad as the decrypted name flashed on the screen. The blood drained from her face. It wasn't a low-level floor manager or a bribed night nurse. It's the chief of surgery. Joon-Sik's jaw tightened, a muscle feathering in his cheek. He authorized the lethal dose. But Elena's brilliant medical mind was already racing ahead, connecting the horrific dots. If the chief of surgery had the clearance to alter one file, he had the clearance to alter them all. Frantically, she cross-referenced the chief's secure audit logs with the hospital's mortality rates over the past 5 years. A cascading list of redacted patient files flooded the screen. Joon-Sik, she whispered, a wave of nausea washing over her as the pristine image of her profession shattered into pieces. It isn't just your mentor. Look at these names. He leaned closer, his dark eyes absorbing the data. These were not random civilians. They were rival syndicate bosses, uncooperative politicians, and whistleblowers. Every single one had been admitted for minor procedures or routine recovery, only to die of sudden, inexplicable surgical complications. He isn't just on Taesung's payroll, Joon-Sik stated, his voice dropping to a terrifying Arctic calm. He is their executioner. He has been using your hospital as a slaughterhouse, sanitizing mob hits under the guise of medical tragedy. Elena stared at the screen, the weight of the betrayal crushing the breath from her lungs. The hospital she had bled for, the oath she had sworn, it was all a gilded front for murder. Her hands began to tremble, not from fear, but from a profound white-hot rage. Joon-Sik saw the tremor. He knelt beside the mattress, bringing his face level with hers. He didn't offer empty platitudes. Instead, his large, warm hand covered hers, stilling the shaking with his steady, anchoring strength. They corrupted your sanctuary, he murmured, his thumb brushing over her knuckles in a gesture that was both a dark comfort and a lethal promise. So we will burn theirs to the ground. The rusted safehouse felt smaller as the morning sun clawed its way through the grime-caked windows. Elena stared at the decrypted files, the weight of the hospital's corruption settling deep in her bones. Beside her, Joon-Sik was already moving. He was strapping a shoulder holster over his ruined silk shirt, his movements sharp and lethal. The Mafia boss had seen enough. He was preparing to wage a shadow war, to hunt Taesung and the chief of surgery in the dark. No, Elena said, the word slicing through the metallic click of his magazine. She stood up, her white uniform stark against the decaying room. You can't kill them. Joon-Sik paused, his dark, void-like eyes locking onto hers. The terrifying composure of the Underworld king was fully restored, masking his injury. They have weaponized your hospital, Elena. They framed us. In my world, treason is met with a bullet, not a debate. I will end this tonight. And tomorrow you'll still be a wanted fugitive, and I will be the crazed nurse who murdered a VIP, she fired back, closing the distance between them. She refused to let his imposing presence shrink her resolve. Taesung controls the police. He controls the narrative. If you kill them in the shadows, he wins. We remain guilty ghosts forever on the run. He looked down at her, the sheer physical proximity sparking that dangerous familiar tension. What is your alternative? He murmured, the scent of sandalwood and cold adrenaline wrapping around her. Elena took a breath, steeling herself against the terrifying reality of her own plan. We don't fight them in the dark. We drag them into the light. I am going to surrender. The silence that followed was deafening. Joon-Sik's jaw clenched, a muscle feathering dangerously in his cheek. He stepped impossibly closer, his large hands gripping her shoulders, completely abandoning his stoic facade. Absolutely not. The police are on Taesung's payroll. If you walk into a precinct, you will not survive the night in a holding cell. I won't go to a precinct, she replied, her voice unwavering, forcing him to look at the fierce brilliance in her eyes. I will surrender directly to the district attorney's office, in front of every major news camera in the city. They can't quietly execute a suspect on live television. I have the medical evidence. I have the digital footprint. But I need a courtroom to make it undeniable. Joon-Sik stared at the black woman standing fearlessly before him, absorbing her audacious, brilliant strategy. She was willingly walking into a cage of monsters to protect the truth, and to protect him. His grip on her shoulders softened, his thumbs lightly grazing her collarbone in a rare, vulnerable concession. He realized he could not command her. He could only stand beside her. If you do this, he whispered, his voice a low, lethal vow, I will not let you stand in that courtroom alone. The heavy oak doors of the courtroom sealed shut, trapping the suffocating tension inside the grand, mahogany-paneled chamber. Elena Cash sat at the defense table, her posture rigidly perfect in her crisp white medical uniform. She was a lone lighthouse in a sea of wolves. Behind her, the gallery was packed, but it wasn't just filled with eager reporters and curious civilians. Scattered among the wooden benches were men in tailored dark suits, their posture too rigid, their eyes too cold. They were Taesung's loyalists, armed and watching her every breath. A silent promise of violence if the legal system failed to bury her. The air felt too thin to inhale. At the front of the room, the district attorney, a slick, confident man whose political campaigns were heavily subsidized by the hospital's shadow accounts, paced before the jury box like a shark circling a life raft. Elena Cash is not a heroic whistleblower, ladies and gentlemen, the prosecutor boomed, his voice dripping with condescension as he pointed a manicured finger toward the defense table. She is a disgruntled, fundamentally unstable employee, who finally buckled under the extreme pressure of the trauma ward. When a high-profile patient tragically succumbed to surgical complications, she didn't accept the medical reality. She spun a paranoid delusion, stole secure hospital property, and fled. Elena kept her expression completely impassive, though her pulse hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The prosecutor was meticulously dismantling her professional integrity, twisting her grueling hospital shifts into psychosis, and her dedication into a motive for murder. The corrupt chief of surgery sat comfortably in the front row, wearing a mask of polite, somber grief. The sheer audacity of the orchestrated lie made Elena's blood burn white-hot. She expects you to believe, the prosecutor scoffed, turning back to the captivated jury, that an entire esteemed medical institution conspired to commit murder. It is the desperate, dangerous fiction of a woman who knows she is guilty. Elena gripped the edge of the heavy oak table, her knuckles turning pale. She had the encrypted files securely logged into evidence, but the prosecution was actively poisoning the room before she even had a chance to speak. The isolation of the courtroom was specifically designed to break her spirit. For a terrifying second, the weight of the syndicate's invisible hands pressing down on the scales of justice felt insurmountable. Then a palpable shift occurred. It wasn't a loud noise, but a sudden drastic drop in the room's atmospheric pressure. The armed syndicate men in the gallery stiffened simultaneously, their hands instinctively twitching toward their concealed holsters. The heavy courtroom doors at the back groaned open. Elena didn't need to turn around to know who had just crossed the threshold. The sharp phantom scent of sandalwood and cold adrenaline seemed to cut through the stale courtroom draft. Kim Joon-Sik stepped into the center aisle, his dark suit impeccable, his terrifying composure absolute. He didn't look at the judge, the scrambling prosecutor, or the traitors in the gallery. His void-like eyes locked instantly onto Elena, honoring the lethal vow he made in the dark. She was not standing alone. The bailiff's voice echoed through the breathless cavern of the courtroom as Elena Cash took the oath. When she sat in the witness box, the stark white of her medical uniform seemed to cut right through the heavy, corrupted shadows of the room. Across the aisle, Kim Joon-Sik sat in the front row. His imposing, sharply dressed frame radiated a controlled, terrifying menace that kept the armed syndicate men in the gallery entirely paralyzed. He did not blink. His void-like eyes were anchored to her, a silent transmission of absolute power. The district attorney approached the stand with a predatory sneer, holding up the hospital's official, falsified autopsy report. Miss Cash, this document, signed by the chief of surgery himself, states the patient died of sudden, catastrophic cardiac arrest. Are you truly arrogant enough to sit here and claim you know better than the head of your own hospital? Elena did not shrink. She leaned forward, her expression a mask of fearless, cold logic. I don't claim to know better, counselor, she replied, her voice ringing out with crystal clarity. I claim to have the truth. She reached into the manila folder resting on the ledge before her and pulled out the faded, original ECG printout she had stolen from the ward. The autopsy report you hold is a meticulously crafted fiction. It relies on the premise that the patient's heart failed naturally, but it ignores the automated digital logs from the surgical floor. The prosecutor bristled, his face flushing. Objection. The witness is speculating. I am reading the raw data. Elena cut him off, projecting her voice to reach the stern, middle-aged judge at the bench. Your Honor, these secondary logs show a manual override on the patient's intravenous smart pump at exactly 2:14 a.m. A lethal volume of potassium chloride was pushed directly into his bloodstream. It induces immediate cardiac arrest, perfectly mirroring natural failure. It is an assassin's favorite chemical. The courtroom erupted in harsh, localized murmurs. The chief of surgery, seated just behind the prosecution, went visibly pale, the polite mask of grief sliding right off his face. Anyone could have tampered with those machines, the prosecutor snapped, his slick composure fracturing. Not anyone, Elena fired back, her dark eyes flashing with brilliant, unyielding authority. She held up the final, decrypted administrative sheet. The 4 pump requires a level 4 biometric login for a manual override of that magnitude. This document, pulled directly from the hospital's hidden archive servers, proves the exact digital footprint used at 2:14 a.m. It wasn't a glitch, and it wasn't a nurse. She leveled her gaze at the terrified chief of surgery, sealing his fate in the sterile light of the courtroom. The biometric login belonged to the chief of surgery. He didn't just sign the fake autopsy to cover up a tragic complication. He personally authorized the execution. Silence slammed into the room with the force of a physical blow. The judge leaned over his bench, his stern expression hardening into outright fury as he demanded the documents. In the front row, a slow, dark smirk curved Joon-Sik's lips. The brilliant, fearless black woman hadn't just defended herself. She had completely dismantled a shadow empire with a single stack of paper. The courtroom was still ringing with the echo of Elena's undeniable medical evidence when the defense attorney stood. The district attorney, flushed and sweating, had retreated to his table, frantically trying to salvage the wreckage of his case. The chief of surgery sat frozen in the gallery, a man realizing the shadow empire he served could not protect him from the blinding light of the law. The defense calls Kim Joon-Sik, the attorney announced, his voice slicing through the heavy, stagnant air. A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. The armed syndicate loyalists stiffened, exchanging panicked glances. Men who ruled the underworld did not take the stand. They did not expose themselves to the permanent record of a sworn oath. It was an unprecedented maneuver in the Mafia world, an act of sheer vulnerability that bordered on suicidal, and it was entirely calculated. Joon-Sik rose from the front row. He buttoned his midnight blue suit jacket with a terrifying, deliberate calm and walked toward the witness box. The air pressure in the room seemed to drop with every step he took. When he sat down, He did not look at the scrambling prosecutor or the stern judge. His dark, void-like eyes found Elena at the defense table. A silent, fiercely protective vow passed between them, a dark spark of connection acknowledging the monumental shift in power. "We finish this together." "Mr. Kim," the defense attorney began, treading carefully around the imposing predator occupying the stand. "You understand you have the right to remain silent? That anything you say regarding your organization could incriminate you." "I waive that right." Joon-Sik's baritone voice resonated through the chamber, low and lethal. The judge leaned forward, entirely captivated by the formidable gravity of the man. "Can you verify Miss Cash's claim?" the attorney asked. "Why would the chief of surgery execute your mentor?" Joon-Sik shifted his gaze to the district attorney, pinning the corrupt lawyer in place. "Because the chief of surgery does not answer to the hospital board. He answers to my underboss, Tae-sung. The assassination was the first move in a coordinated syndicate coup. My mentor was killed to destabilize my empire, enforce a vulnerability." The prosecutor jumped up. "Objection. This is hearsay from a known criminal." "It is a financial fact," Joon-Sik interrupted, his voice cutting through the objection with Arctic authority. He reached into his jacket, pulled a sleek, encrypted flash drive from his pocket, and set it on the wooden ledge. "Miss Cash provided the medical footprint of a murder. I am providing the receipts. On that drive are 10 years of offshore wire transfers connecting Tae-sung's shadow accounts directly to the chief of surgery's private trusts. It is payment for the execution of rivals, sanitized as surgical complications." The courtroom exploded into chaos. The judge's gavel slammed repeatedly against the sound block, but the sharp cracks were swallowed by the sheer uproar of the gallery. Elena let out a trembling, triumphant breath, her heart hammering as she looked up at Joon-Sik. He had just burned down his own underworld secrecy to validate her truth, cementing a dangerous, unbreakable alliance in the absolute center of the battlefield. The heavy crack of the judge's gavel finally cut through the deafening roar of the courtroom, each strike hitting like a gunshot against the mahogany block. "Order!" the judge bellowed, his face flushed with a terrifying, righteous fury. "I will have order, or I will hold this entire gallery in contempt." Silence slammed back into the room, thick and suffocating. The district attorney was visibly trembling, his perfectly tailored suit suddenly looking 2 sizes too big as he stared at the sleek black flash drive Kim Joon-Sik had placed on the witness ledge. "Your Honor, you cannot admit unverified digital evidence from a known syndicate head." The prosecutor stammered, desperation bleeding into his voice. "This is a mockery of the legal process. The only mockery in my courtroom today is the prosecution's case," the judge snapped, leaning over the bench with eyes like flint. He gestured sharply to his clerk. "Upload the drive to the central monitors. Now." The air pressure in the room plummeted as the large screens mounted on the courtroom walls flickered to life. Elena held her breath, her dark eyes locked on the digital displays. What appeared wasn't a chaotic jumble of numbers, but a meticulously organized ledger of blood. Row after row of offshore wire transfers flooded the screens. The dates of the massive deposits aligned flawlessly with the dates of the hospital's sudden, fatal surgical complications, including the exact hour Joon-Sik's mentor was murdered. At the top of the receiving accounts was the private trust of the chief of surgery, and the originating shell corporations were undeniably tied to Tae-sung, Joon-Sik's traitorous underboss. As you can see, Joon-Sik's low, vibrating baritone filled the silence, his terrifying composure unshakable from the witness stand. The price for a lethal dose of potassium chloride was $500,000. Paid in full, sanitized through a Cayman account, and authorized by the man sitting in your front row. All eyes snapped to the chief of surgery. The polite, grieving mask he had worn all week shattered completely. He practically collapsed into his pew, his face draining of all color as a wretched, panicked gasp escaped him. His legal shields, his pristine medical reputation, and his entire existence had been incinerated in less than 5 minutes. In the back of the gallery, the armed syndicate loyalists exchanged frantic, terrified looks. Tae-sung's flawless, shadow-bound coup had just been exposed in the blinding, undeniable light of a federal court. There was no more legal cover to hide behind. Elena exhaled a shaky breath, the crushing weight of the hospital's corruption finally breaking. She turned her gaze to the witness stand. Joon-Sik was already looking at her. Amidst the absolute devastation of his enemies, His dark eyes held a profound, reverent heat. The Mafia king and the fearless black nurse had brought a corrupt empire to its knees, their dangerous alliance forging an undeniable, unbreakable power. The gavel fell with the heavy, definitive thud of a guillotine. "This court has seen enough," the judge's voice boomed, vibrating with absolute disdain as he glared down at the sweating, humiliated district attorney. "The prosecution's case is not merely circumstantial. It is a malicious, orchestrated fabrication." The judge turned his stern gaze toward the defense table, his expression softening marginally as he looked at the black nurse who had single-handedly exposed a shadow empire. "Miss Cash, your professional integrity and profound courage in the face of overwhelming intimidation are a credit to your oath. All charges against you are dismissed with prejudice. You are entirely exonerated." A collective gasp swept through the gallery, followed by the frantic scratching of reporters' pens. "Furthermore," the judge continued, his eyes shifting to the formidable Mafia boss standing near the witness box, "the arrest warrants associated with this falsified autopsy are voided. However, I am immediately issuing a bench warrant for the chief of surgery and any co-conspirators tied to these offshore accounts. Bailiffs, take that man into custody." Chaos erupted. As armed officers converged on the front row to apprehend the weeping, disgraced chief of surgery, the courtroom descended into a frenzied shouting match. Flashbulbs from smuggled press cameras strobed wildly against the mahogany walls. Amidst the pandemonium, Elena stood. The suffocating weight of the frame-up dissolved, leaving behind an intoxicating rush of absolute triumph. She had beaten the monsters at their own game. She looked up just as Joon-Sik closed the distance between them. The terrifying Underworld king ignored the scrambling lawyers and the shouting bailiffs. He stopped directly in front of her, his imposing presence shielding her from the frenzy of the room. The dark, electric tension between them flared, a silent, breathless acknowledgement of their dangerous, unbreakable victory. But Joon-Sik's void-like eyes suddenly narrowed, tracking a subtle shift in the room's chaotic perimeter. Near the heavy oak doors at the back of the gallery, the syndicate loyalists were quietly breaking formation, and slipping through the heavy brass handles, shielded by the sheer panic of the crowd, was the architect of the betrayal himself, Tae-sung. The traitorous underboss had come to watch his rival fall, only to witness his own absolute destruction. Recognizing his legal shield was completely gone, he bolted into the courthouse corridors. "He is running," Joon-Sik murmured, his voice dropping to a low, lethal register meant only for her. The chilling composure of the witness stand vanished, replaced instantly by the cold, calculating predator who ruled the streets. Elena looked at the swinging doors, her dark eyes hardening with brilliant, unyielding resolve. The courtroom had delivered the truth, but it could not deliver the final consequence. She met Joon-Sik's gaze, offering no medical ethics, no hesitation, only her silent, absolute blessing. The law had finished its work. Now it was time for the Mafia boss to finish his. The courthouse corridors were a blur of panicked reporters and shouting bailiffs, but Joon-Sik moved through the chaos like a ghost of vengeance. He didn't run. A king did not run. He simply walked with a terrifying, predatory purpose, the heavy mahogany doors slamming shut behind him, leaving the sterile light of justice for the unforgiving shadows of his own making. Elena remained in the gallery, her dark eyes tracking his departure. The law had cleared their names, but the scales of the underworld required blood to balance. She stood tall in her crisp white uniform, her silence an absolute, unwavering mandate for him to finish the war. Down in the cavernous concrete expanse of the subterranean parking garage, the echoes of Tae-sung's frantic footsteps betrayed him. The traitorous underboss fumbled with the keys to a sleek, armored sedan, his hands shaking violently as the reality of his exposed coup set in. He had lost his corrupt police shield, his hospital executioner, and his entire shadow empire in a matter of minutes. Before he could unlock the driver's side door, the harsh fluorescent lights above flickered and died, plunging the section into a suffocating gloom. "You were always a coward, Tae-sung." A low, vibrating baritone echoed from the darkness. Tae-sung spun around, pulling a suppressed weapon from his coat, but he was entirely too late. Two of Joon-Sik's fiercely loyal bodyguards melted out of the shadows, stripping the gun from his grip and forcing him to his knees on the freezing concrete. Joon-Sik stepped into the dim halo of a distant security light. His midnight blue suit was impeccable, his expression an impenetrable mask of absolute, Arctic cruelty. He looked down at the man who had orchestrated the murder of his mentor, and dared to hunt the woman he had claimed. "Boss, please," Taesung choked out, his arrogance completely shattered. "It was business. Just a shift in power. You would have done the same. I would never have been careless enough to leave a brilliant nurse alive to find my mistakes," Joon-Sik replied smoothly, the terrifying composure of his voice slicing through the damp air. "And I certainly would never have underestimated her." He didn't draw out the execution. There was no theatrical monologue. Joon-Sik simply unbuttoned his jacket, drew the sleek black firearm from his shoulder holster, and leveled it with cold, calculating precision. The traitor squeezed his eyes shut as the Mafia boss delivered the final, brutal payoff of their alliance. The suppressed shot was barely a whisper in the massive garage, but it sealed the fate of the city's hierarchy. Joon-Sik holstered his weapon, stepping past the wreckage of the coup without a second glance. The betrayal was severed. His empire was secure. He turned his back on the darkness, adjusting his cuffs, and walked back up toward the blinding light of the courthouse to return to the fearless black woman who had won him his crown. The sterile corridors of the hospital were unrecognizable a month after the gavel fell. The suffocating weight of corruption had been entirely excised, surgically removed by the blinding light of the courtroom. The chief of surgery was awaiting federal sentencing, and the administrative board had been ruthlessly purged of Taesung's shadow money. Elena Cash walked the trauma ward not as a terrified witness, but as the undeniable architect of its salvation. Her crisp white uniform remained a symbol of her unwavering oath, but the way the remaining staff parted for her, with a mixture of profound respect and quiet awe, spoke of the terrifying authority she now commanded. She had stared down monsters and broken their empire with a single stack of medical files. Yet, her true empire lay far beyond the fluorescent lights of the ER. High above the glittering expanse of the city, the penthouse had transformed from a gilded cage into an impenetrable fortress of shared sovereignty. Kim Joon-Sik stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city sprawled beneath him like a conquered kingdom. The underworld had fractured and bled in the wake of Taesung's execution, but it had solidified under Joon-Sik's absolute, brutal command. There were no more whispers of rebellion. The syndicate elders bowed to the Mafia king, who had weaponized the law itself to obliterate his enemies. The private elevator chimed, breaking the heavy, victorious silence of the room. Joon-Sik turned as Elena stepped into the grand entryway. She had traded her medical whites for a stunning, tailored crimson dress that moved with her every step, a brilliant, fearless contrast against the dark mahogany of his world. She crossed the room with the calculated grace of a woman who knew exactly what she was worth, completely unbothered by the armed guards stationed outside their wing. Joon-Sik closed the distance between them, his void-like eyes no longer holding the cold calculation of a predator assessing leverage, but the dark, consuming reverence of a man who had found his ultimate equal. He didn't issue a command. He reached out, his large hand slipping around her waist, pulling her flesh against his imposing frame. The spark of tension that had ignited in a bloody kitchen and burned through a federal courtroom finally consumed them both. "The board appointed a new chief of surgery today," Elena murmured, resting her hands flat against his chest, feeling the steady, powerful rhythm of his heart beneath his midnight blue suit. "The ward is clean, and the streets are quiet," Joon-Sik replied, his voice a low, vibrating baritone that sent a familiar shiver down her spine. His thumb brushed along her jawline, a gesture of absolute devotion laced with a lethal promise to anyone who dared cross her. "Because they know exactly who rules them." He leaned down, capturing her lips in a kiss that tasted of victory, power, and unapologetic darkness. Elena surrendered to the pull but gave no ground, her brilliant mind and fierce spirit matching his brutal strength flawlessly. She was no longer just a trauma nurse bound by the rigid rules of medicine. She was the queen of his shadows, standing fearlessly by his side as they reigned over the city together.